Our first guest this morning is indeed a lady of tremendous courage and tremendous character, former First Lady Betty Ford. In the summer of 1974, Betty Ford was looking forward to her husband's retirement from politics. But upon President Nixon's resignation, all of Betty's plans changed. She was now thrust even further into the public eye. Despite painful spinal arthritis and constant media scrutiny, Betty became one of America's most popular First Ladies. She championed civil rights and the ERA. She spoke candidly to politicians and the press and helped increase the nation's public health awareness when her breast cancer resulted in a mastectomy. When Gerald Ford ran for the presidency in 1976, many supporters voted to keep Betty in the White House, as well as her husband. But after a grueling campaign, they lost the election. Upon settling in California, Betty's life sunk to an all-time low amidst painkillers and alcohol, until her husband and her children intervened and rescued her with their love. Betty came to grips first with her prescription drug dependency and then with her alcoholism. During the first few years of her recovery, she established the Betty Ford Treatment Center. Now, with her new book, A Glad Awakening, Betty Ford speaks with candor about her problem and her recovery. And it is a delight for us to welcome Betty Ford to the show. Good morning, Mrs. Ford.
Good morning,
Eileen. It is nice to have you here. And I must tell our viewers and you that I spent the weekend with you with The Times of My Life and your new book, A Glad Awakening. And I also had a chance to preview the film tonight. And I've always admired you, but now my admiration is just enormous. You've been through so much and you've recovered, and that's really the good news. That is the Glad Awakening, isn't it?
That's the book. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and you were telling me there's such joy in recovery.
Well, it's about the positive and the joy that there is in being well and waking up each morning feeling good and knowing you have that wonderful day ahead, because I had some very sick days.
Mm-hmm. Go back, if you don't mind, to the summer of '74 when everything was breaking loose with Watergate, and you were looking forward to your husband's retirement. It didn't work that way, did it?
No, that's true. I had planned pretty much. In fact, we'd even looked for retirement place in Florida, living in Washington and Florida both. And the idea of having to move into the responsible job of being a First Lady had a tremendous impact. But there was a wonderful challenge in that too, because suddenly you're together much more, living in the White House. My husband wasn't away so much. And I found that I had, with that responsibility, also a lot of power as the First Lady, which I could get things done, and that was helpful.
Speaking of living together, I loved it that you were the first Lady to break the separate bedroom policy, right?
Well, I don't know. That's what they said.
You said, I'll give up a lot for my country, but I'm not giving up that, right?
I think I needed that support that was there.
It's interesting because throughout the book, your family and the doctors and all the people close to you speak up a lot. And there's a lot of talk of the word enabling. And I'm wondering, even back in '74, was the president enabling you?
I think the president had his hands full, and perhaps by not seeing my needs, you could say he was enabling. But as the Republican leader for many years, traveling on the road and being gone so much, of course, he didn't see my needs. Now, when we were together in the White House with our time in the evenings spent either in state dinners, it was a busy time, though. We got into the bicentennial year toward the end, '76, and demanding times. So it was hard to be there for each other.
It was also probably difficult for you to accept his running again for re-election, and that campaign must have been so grueling. There's no place to hide, and you were in constant pain during those years.
Being in the White House is Q is living in a fishbowl. I continued with neck pain, the pinched nerve in my neck. I had a lot of arthritis that I was being treated for, and the schedule was demanding, so the idea was keep going. During the campaign, of course, it was sometimes 5 stops a day.
Do you think in any way the pressures of your life contributed to the escalation of use of alcohol and drugs?
No, I don't think so. I think the pain compounded itself, and of course we do know with mood-altering drugs such as tranquilizers, sleeping pills, pain medication. Those things, as you take them, you have to take more and more. And they have extended what we refer to as half-lives. So you begin to build a tolerance. And as you take more, there's more effect. And any small amount of alcohol is compounded when you mix synergistically duo addiction of both pills and any amount of alcohol.
It's interesting, you have had to let go and let God, and those words ring in my ears from my reading this weekend. Difficult for anyone, but especially a woman of control. You like being in control.
I like being in control, but luckily I had had a very strong religious belief, and so God in my life was not difficult for me to accept. I had been accepting Him all along. I just had been using my will instead of His will, and today I know His will.
You were so wonderful as First Lady. You went through the horrors of mastectomy. The American Cancer Society breast examinations jumped 300% in this country. I guess you had no idea when you went public with that it would be that outcome.
I think that was being honest with the public. And when we went into office, things with government were somewhat questionable. We promised honesty during our administration, and that was one of the first things that confronted me about honesty, was to tell people what that operation was. And it did probably save a lot of lives, because people did have examinations. Women made great donations to the Cancer Society. I know one man wrote, just as an example, his mother had had a mastectomy many years before, and it had never been discussed in their family. And finally now he was able to talk to his mother about it. It made all the difference in their relationship. They didn't have to hide it anymore.
Which is really what you're doing with A Glad Awakening. You're not hiding behind anything. It's all there, and it is a very sensitive book. There are very moving moments in this book. I just wonder, is it difficult for you to sit here this morning and talk about it?
I think I've relived it so much in the last almost 9 years now, and my reason for going through the writing of it and trying to help other people realize that with my own realization, maybe they will see some of the recovery in themselves. We as a family feel that if you are willing to address it and face up to the disease, it is treatable. It's a very treatable disease. Alcoholism, drug addiction, chemical dependency, whatever you want to call it, is probably one of the most treatable of our diseases. It's a progressive disease, and it's chronic. And of course, abstinence is important, because you can't address it until you get rid of the drugs, whatever those drugs may be. Often, such as in my case, as with most women, they're all legal drugs. Prescription drugs, alcohol, both of those are legal.
You talk
very sociably acceptable too.
Well, because a doctor prescribed them. I mean, you're not an addict, a doctor gave them to you, right?
But I must say, I have learned, if doctors have to prescribe for you, ask them, are there side effects? What are the side effects? No, if the doctor can't tell you right at that moment, have him look it up, or have your pharmacist look it up. Know what you're putting in your mouth. You're responsible for what you take.
You didn't always know that, though, and there were a lot of painful times in the not knowing. You were very outspoken when you were in the White House, and I remember in watching the movie, the president was saying, oh, there go another 10 points, 10 percentage points.
Well, yes. That was a 60-minute interview.
But it turned out that that was very popular. 70% of the country voted that they agreed with you.
It was about 3 or 4 weeks later that support came through.
But you were outspoken in terms of being a mother and issues like premarital sex and other issues. Have you always been, even as Betty Bloomer back in Grand Rapids, Michigan, outspoken and to the point?
I don't think so much so until I was perhaps defending my children and maybe defending myself.
Any regrets about those statements?
No, not now. I think that we have to be, really, it's being realistic and being honest. And maybe I was a little more candid than most women.
You worked so hard for the ERA and for civil rights, and I think to this day, women, well, you only recently were voted the most popular woman in our country, even now. Are those additional pressures when people look up to you so much?
I don't know that I think of myself as a role model, and I think the book particularly says that I'm just an ordinary woman called on stage when my husband became president at an extraordinary time. And I think the sequel to the first book, The Times of My Life, which is this new book, Betty, A Glad Awakening, says that I am no different than any other woman, and that is why I'm willing to reach out to somebody else, and hopefully by what I have learned, they will be able to recognize some of those things in themselves, the capability to confront and the capability to survive. It's a survival story, and I think of it as a love story in our family as far as the intervention. The movie tonight with Jenna Rollins is very well done.
It really is.
She has played my role so beautifully, and I'm really glad that David Wolper talked us as a family into doing.
There were some words and some things that we talked about that I think we ought to really get into to help people listening. Intervention, it occurred with your family for you after you had left the White House, and actually after you got the house in order out in California. What do you think led the family? And it was really Susan who spearheaded it, but what led her to really believe there was trouble?
Well, I think most of the family, the boys were living in their own sort of abodes away from home, and Mike was married and living on the East Coast. Susan was living in her own condominium, but nearby, and as the youngest in the family, and certainly the only other female in the family, she was left a little bit to see that mother was happy and taken care of. Susan was more aware of the deterioration of my health. My husband, I think, being just out of office, had so many demands on his time. He was traveling a great deal, speaking here, there, and everywhere at colleges and different requests as when you leave office. We both were busy working on our books, all of those demands, but Susan could see how I was not focusing. I didn't know what was happening. I was sort of in cloud 9 in my own little oblivia a lot at the late time in the day. By the time I had taken the many, many pills that I was prescribed with. And then late in the day when I would have a cocktail and maybe 2, she knew that I was losing focus. Eventually I got to the point where I didn't want to get dressed, I didn't want to see friends, I didn't want to participate. You might say life, I just sort of wanted life to pass me by. I had no urge to live. This really scared her tremendously. We had a family that was built on a good, strong foundation of love and concern. She organized the family through the help of Dr. Joe Cruz, who was a physician that knew us both.
Who became the first administrator?
Well, he was a recovering alcoholic, and he knew what to do. And she got everybody home, and they surprised me one morning. Think of it as April Fool's Day. It was April 1st, and they walked in unexpectedly, and they had all learned their lines and knew they could each, in their own concerned but loving way, intervene in this disease by confronting me with how I had disappointed them, how I'd let them down, how they had been hurt by my actions, individual occasions.
And that is the way an intervention takes place, providing there's also then a place for the dependent to go.
Yes, well, right at that point, of course, there had to be a period for me to go through detox or detoxification, because I couldn't get help until I was withdrawn from all of the prescription drugs and the alcohol.
Were you up to about 30 pills a day?
About 30 pills a day. I've even heard of people having more pills than that
sure.
a day. So
I'm sure of that.
Can't believe it.
When you entered Long Beach Naval Hospital and there were 4 beds in the room, that was certainly not the way a former First Lady was to be treated. That was difficult for you.
I had not expected a 4-bedroom. I had, in my mind, focused on a private room. They did have double rooms, but they thought it would be best for me to learn that I had no special privileges. I would be treated just like everybody else. We all wore name tags with our first name. That was all. And even when my family came, even President Ford, he was treated as just another husband, an enabler, someone who had been able to deny my alcoholism by ignoring it and you know, feeling that I would probably get well on my own, making all kinds of excuses.
Well, you used the word deny, and denial is such an enormous part. The hardest part for you was accepting the alcoholism part of your addiction, wasn't it? Why do you think it's easy for other people to know, but very hard for the alcoholic to accept?
Well, I think that the alcoholic has, in most cases, is a very high achiever and thinks of themselves as a perfectionist and being able to be in control, and they like to be in control, and they don't like to know they've failed. I certainly didn't want to know I'd failed. I was willing to accept more easily the fact that I had become addicted to prescription drugs because I was given and prescribed the prescription drugs, but I knew that alcohol, you know, that was something I used myself. And so that, to me, was most difficult to accept.
What is a definition of an alcoholic? If someone is watching and something is being triggered by what you're saying, how do you know that you have a problem?
Well, when you become preoccupied with when, where, what you're going to drink, or are people going to be drinking. In other words, it's a consistent and repetitive use of a drug, one or more drugs, when it's having a negative effect in your life. It's a preoccupation with that drug.
And you know, you talk about the joy of recovery, Mrs. Ford. You and Susan have put it back together again, and yet for a long time she felt like she was always covering for you, and the other kids felt the same way.
They were covering. They had a lot of anger, they had a lot of guilt, they had a lot of resentment, and many times they had to go and make appearances because I wasn't well. It was a manipulative thing on my part. If I didn't want to go, I didn't want to make the appearance, I could be sick.
Many people think of the Betty Ford Treatment Center as a place for celebrities. That is not so. I now know that. And the price is comparatively incredibly reasonable. I mean, for $5,500, you put your life back together
We
again.
feel it's less costly at $155 a day.
You are very hands-on. You are not a figurehead. I mean, you work every day, don't you, at the center?
I try to be there almost every day, but I am out of town some, so I'm president of the board of directors, and I'm very active in the administration as well as working with patients and speaking.
It's for everyone.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I believe that all of our patients are the most important. Each and every one is most important patient in the place.
As we talked about intervention for those watching, if there is an alcoholic who doesn't have family, how can an intervention take place?
People who are concerned with that person, if they have friends, an employer, perhaps a school, even if a youngster does not have family, there is somebody that's concerned about them, and that concerned person can rally a group around them.
And the thing to do is call AA, right?
That's right.
Or the National Center on Alcoholism, is
Correct.
that another word? Tonight, the movie that airs tonight, it does air here on Channel 5, and I watched it this weekend. As I said, Gina Rowlands, there's so much pain that comes through her that I guess was your own. It was your pain, right? It's very real, this movie, isn't it?
She's a fabulous actress, and the movie is very close to our story of our family. Naturally, there have to be some cases where you have to make exception for literary or whatever it is on television, and but we're very pleased with the story it presents.
You know, I think it's a movie for the whole family. I mean, there's no doubt, you and I were talking, we live in this polydrug society. This is a station very committed through a campaign called Don't Be Pushed to alcohol and drug problems. But it is for the whole family because everyone is involved when someone is sick with alcoholism or drug
Alcoholism
dependency.
is a family disease.
Right.
The shame, the guilt, the anger, all of those things are felt not only by the patient, but they are felt by the family. And we really require a patient to bring family when they come to treatment. And we expect them to spend a week at least learning how they have been affected by the alcoholism.
Well, I tell you, we are all very affected by you. You are, I think, a woman of enormous courage, and I think every woman in this country admires you and thanks you. I really think that we all owe you
Eileen.
a real thank you. The movie does air tonight at 9 o'clock on Channel 5. It is called The Betty Ford Story, and Betty's book, I'd like to show it to you, is called Betty, A Glad Awakening by Betty Ford with Chris Chase, and it is a remarkable story of a remarkable recovery. Thank you, Mrs.
Thank you so
Ford.
much.
Lovely to meet you.
Very nice to see
Thank
you.
you.